They say that time flies when you're having fun, which means I must have been having an awful lot of fun with the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K, because I can't believe that it's been almost a year since I bought this camera. That's 52 weeks of learning its in and outs, its pros and its cons, the little delights and the strange quirks. And I think I've probably learnt something in every single one of those 52 weeks. So, in no particular order, here's everything that I've learned about having the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera for the last year. In all my time using this camera, I have never felt like I needed the additional EVF that Blackmagic sell. That's probably because the flip out screen on this camera is so good and is really bright, and I can see it in the brightest of conditions, although I live in the UK, so I'm not exactly plagued by bright sunlight. Number 2. So far, the screen on the back of the camera has not broken, despite my initial fears that it might. That's because the hinges feel quite crudely made to me, and the ribbon feeding from the camera to the screen seems really exposed, just waiting to get snagged. Fingers crossed, it remains unbroken. Number 3, the image in this thing is absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's really, really nice. There's something I just can't explain about it, but it's not only sharp and clear, but it seems to have great handling of colour and the highlights roll off nicely. It's hard to put into words. I don't know why, but I have to format cards twice with this camera. If I only format them once, then I'll start recording and very shortly the camera will drop frames and then it will stop recording altogether. I have no idea why formatting the cards twice fixes this problem, but it does. Number 5, I still need a cage to shoot the way I like. Although this camera seems like it has everything that you could possibly need built into it straight out the box, I still need to rig it up to shoot the way that I like to shoot, and it definitely benefits from having a few extra accessories added to it, and that means a cage. I wouldn't like to take this camera on a professional shoot and not have it rigged up with some extra accessories. You can actually shoot handheld with this camera a lot easier than the previous Blackmagic Pocket Cinema cameras. That's probably because of the flip out screen. You're just not going to want to do it for very long. Image stabilization doesn't work with every lens that has it. I think this has got something to do with the fact that different lenses need to draw different amounts of power, and the 6K Pro isn't always able to deliver what's needed. The dynamic range in this camera is maybe a little bit better than in the 4K, even though both cameras are claimed to have the same amount of dynamic range at 13 stops. A few people have told me this, and I've done a few crude experiments myself, and it seems that there might be something in it. Having internal LEDs is the best thing ever, and I never want to use a camera that doesn't have them. Going forward, all cameras should come equipped with internal NDs. On very bright days you may still need an ND filter. That's because the internal NDs on this camera only go up to 6 stops. So if you're on a bright day and you want to open up the aperture all the way, you're going to need a bigger boat. You also might need one if you want to fine tune the image, because the NDs only go up in increments of 2 at a time. Number 11, I've learned that I will never see the maximum quality out of this camera. That's because to get the best quality out of this camera, you're probably going to need a top-of-the-line CFast card. I also say probably because Blackmagic don't give any recommendations on their website of what to use to shoot in the very best quality Q0. They only recommend a compression of up to 5:1 for various cards and media. So I just don't know. Rolling shutter is still bad with this camera, so if you're doing any handheld type of work, then you need to be careful that you don't accidentally do any whip pans or any Jason Bourne style shaky cam, or you're going to end up with the old Jello effect. You can reduce rolling shutter a lot by shooting in one of the lower resolutions or by cropping in on the sensor. So shooting in the 5.7K mode or in the aspect ratio of 2.4:1 would be a good idea if you're shooting a lot of handheld stuff or really fast moving subjects. 14. The bigger Sony batteries are still crap. Blackmagic claims that you can get up to about an hour shooting on one, but I'm lucky if I get about 45 minutes maximum. 15. It has the same problem as the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K in that the battery indicator isn't very accurate, but at least on the 4K it gives me a percentage, whereas on the 6K Pro I can only toggle between the voltage and the little battery icon. The camera only shoots ProRes up to DCI 4K, so there's no 6K ProRes option in this camera, but it does downsample it from the whole sensor, so at least it looks nice. I've learned that I never want to go back to having a camera without false colour. It's the easiest and simplest way to get your exposure accurate. And if you don't know how to use it, I suggest looking it up because you will never look back. The camera is surprisingly heavy. I mean, it's an absolute beast considering it's made from lightweight carbon fiber polycarbonate composite. And I don't know what that is, but it seems surprisingly like plastic to me. Had to write that down on the back. Lightweight carbon fiber polycarbonate composite. I'm pretty sure the camera forgets settings over time. I'm not exactly sure why or how, but it feels like I'll go away and come back to the camera and be like, oh, the guides have disappeared. I don't remember turning them off. I think maybe it's got something to do with taking the battery out of the camera for an extended amount of time, but I'm not 100% sure. The camera gets uglier every time I look at it. It's like a cross between a 1990s hi-fi and a stealth bomber, and this big extra lens mount doesn't exactly help with its appearance. I much prefer the design language of the original Blackmagic pocket cinema camera, and yes, I am aware that people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. I've learnt that I've never had a reason to press this button on the front here. Blackmagic say it's for vlogging, so you can press the button with your thumb, but you'd have to have arms like He-Man to be able to vlog with this camera. I mean, I do have arms like He-Man, but somebody like you wouldn't be able to handle it. I don't know if this is an exhaust or an air intake, but either way, hot air circulates around this part of the camera, and if you're shooting handheld like this, your wrist can get pretty uncomfortable from the heat. You get a strap in the box, unlike the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, and I've never used it. The Blackmagic Gen 5 look straight out of camera is actually pretty nice, and for a lot of work, and particularly fast turnaround work, this will probably be enough. Or if you're just starting out in colour grading and you don't know what you're doing, you can stick this on and you will probably be more than happy with the results. I've learnt that not all Sony batteries are created equal, and the cheap ones have less power and therefore don't last as long in the camera. So if you want to go down the route of using internal batteries with this camera, you're probably better sticking with the Blackmagic official ones. Not only can you power the camera through the USB-C port, but you can actually charge the battery if you have the camera turned off. But you will need a power bank that can output 12 volts rather than the usual 5. The camera doesn't output a 6K or even a 4K stream over the HDMI. It's HD all the way with this. So if you wanted to use an external recorder, you can't. Although I'm not sure exactly why you would. But more to the point, you can't use a 4K monitor, which could cause a problem in some situations. I've learnt that I keep forgetting that I can power this camera from the mains with the supplied power lead, and that I don't have to sit around waiting for batteries to charge if I'm filming indoors. I hate the port covers on this camera. They get in the way of each other and they get in the way of anything that you want to plug in. And if you're using a cage, then they become next to impossible to open, although that's not exactly Blackmagic's fault because they don't make the cages. Dropping to 4K is a good way to get some extra reach out of your lenses and to also save some file space, rather than shooting in 6K and cropping in post. For YouTube, 6K is just overkill, mainly because the YouTube compression compresses the image so much that the viewer isn't able to see just how good the image truly is out of this camera, which is kind of bad news for you. The camera isn't just heavy, but it also has a strange centre of gravity, being very front heavy and trying to twist out of your grip whenever you're hand holding it, leading to a fatigued hand very fast. 6K Blackmagic RAW really is magic and plays back just as good as the 4K RAW even on my older machine. The false colour sometimes tells you that you are clipping the black point when you are not in fact clipping the black point. This isn't a bad thing, I'm just saying that you sometimes take the footage into the computer and when you look at the picture, there is still detail in the area that was telling you it was clipped. I don't like the fact there are no hard stops on the ND filters and you can effectively just cycle through them forever. Now this is probably my fault, I should train myself to look at the screen more often and see which stop I'm on, but I'd prefer it if there was a hard stop. The design of the Blackmagic UI really spoils you, and anytime you have to go back and use another camera, it feels really archaic. It's nice to have a camera that receives new updates and new features. You get the feeling that if Blackmagic can improve something, that they're gonna do it, and they're not gonna hold back on you. If you want to shoot HD, you can only do it in ProRes. There are no B-RAW options for this. Number 39. HD does use the full 6K sensor size, so you don't have to put up with any crop factor. 4K ProRes DCI crops into the 5.7K sensor area, whereas the UHD 4K uses the full 6K frame. So even though the DCI is bigger pixel-wise, it actually has a narrower field of view than the UHD. This can be a little bit counterintuitive. I've learned that I really should set up presets with this camera to make switching between common shooting settings so much easier. You can store up to 10 presets on the camera and it really would make my life a lot easier, but I still haven't done it. It's very easy to accidentally switch frame rates when switching between screens. I quite often drop down to 24 frames per second instead of 25 frames per second. This is totally my fault, but it is something to keep an eye on. The fastest SD cards in the world can only shoot at a compression rate of 8:1. You're going to need a CFast card or an SSD if you want to shoot at a lower compression rate or if you want to shoot higher frame rates. The camera feels massive compared to the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. I was really shocked the first time I opened the box and saw it. It's a right chunky lad. The only way to get 120 frames per second out of this camera is in the 2.8K mode. That's a big crop in on the sensor, but it still is in B-RAW, which is pretty cool. 4K ProRes HQ takes up more file space on a card than Blackmagic RAW 6K 12:1 compression. So for most things I prefer to shoot in RAW and have the advantages of higher resolution and a smaller file size. Shooting 4K on this camera crops into a smaller size than the entire sensor on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. So if you're only thinking of using this camera as a 4K camera, then you might want to consider that camera instead. The sensor isn't a true Super 35mm and actually measures a little bit smaller, and I'm going to have to read this. It's 23.10mm by 12.99mm, with Super 35mm film being 24.89mm by 1866mm. You can't record to more than one media at a time with this camera, so even though you have three options, an SD card, a CFast card and an SSD hard drive, you can't record backups no matter what, not even a low-res proxy. 6K files can be absolutely massive, and every time I download one onto my computer, I'll wince a little bit at just how big it is for a few minutes of footage. There's a strange clicking whenever you change resolution on this camera, like something mechanical is actually moving, and the screen on the back of the camera blacks out for a moment. I can't think for the life of me what would physically be moving in the camera when changing resolutions. If you know, let me know in the comments. It's not too bad at taking photos. It's a 21 megapixel camera that shoots in the DNG RAW format, so you can open up the images in almost any photo editing software. And the pictures are pretty good. It's not just a gimmick like I thought it was originally. Wow, so it turned out that it was exactly 52 weeks, and it was exactly 52 things that I learned. What a happy coincidence for me, and thank goodness I didn't have to put any filler in there just to fudge the numbers and get it up to 52. If you want to check out another video, here's one that YouTube recommends that you should watch. And if you want to like and subscribe, I'm not going to stop you. Cheers.